She had never tasted a meal like this before. In the dimly lit barrack-filled camp, where the air smelled of sweat, fear, and stale rations, a single mysterious package changed everything. Wrapped in plain brown paper, its contents promised nothing but confusion and disbelief. To the women in the camp, prisoners who had been starved, humiliated, and crushed under the weight of wartime propaganda, the smell that wafted from the package was almost unbearable. Fresh bread, pork, a scent so foreign to their experience that it almost seemed cruel. They were POWs, and they had been taught to expect nothing but suffering. But as one woman, trembling, tore open the package, the first taste was nothing short of a betrayal. Why would an enemy soldier, an American cowboy, send them this? They refused to eat it at first. For months they had endured endless days of deprivation, their bodies emaciated, their spirits battered. The rations, when they came, were barely enough to keep them alive. A thin broth with wilted vegetables, rice mixed with sawdust, sometimes a scrap of fish. It was always the same, always too little. Sickness had spread through the camp like wildfire. No medicine to stop it, no doctors to care for them. They had learned to ignore the fever, the coughs, the constant gnawing in their stomachs. Pain was a part of their existence, just as the harsh shouts of the guards and the looming presence of barbed wire were. The only consistency in their lives was the brutality of it all. And then, one morning, it came. A package. It appeared as if from nowhere, dropped on the dirt floor just inside their barracks. At first, they all thought it was a mistake, an error in delivery, a package meant for someone else. But there was no label, no markings, just plain brown paper wrapped tightly around it. It was small enough to be carried in one hand, but the weight of it seemed strange to them. Why would someone send a package to the likes of them? Prisoners of war, stripped of dignity, no longer even considered human by the outside world. Their hearts pounded with a mix of suspicion and fear, for they had been told nothing of kindness, nothing of mercy. This was the enemy, after all. This was the side that had bombed their cities, the side that had taken everything from them. The first woman to reach it hesitated. Her hand hovered over the package, trembling. She turned it over, looking for any clue as to what could possibly be inside. For a moment, it seemed as though the whole barracks held its breath. Then, as if unsure of what else to do, she tore at the paper, revealing the contents. The smell hit them immediately, rich, salty, unmistakably familiar. Bread, pork, the scent of cooked bacon. It was as though the world outside had ceased to exist for a moment, replaced only by the aroma of a meal they had long since forgotten. The room grew tense, as if each woman was waiting for someone else to make the first move. They had been conditioned to fear anything that came from the outside world. This bounty, could not be trusted. There was no explanation for it. They exchanged glances, whispers passing quickly between them, each woman reluctant to touch the food, as though it might bite back. They had been taught to expect cruelty. In training, in their families, they had been told that to be captured would be a fate worse than death. They were taught to honor the emperor above all, and to surrender meant dishonor, humiliation, and death. The thought that their captors might show them kindness was incomprehensible. Even more so, the idea that they might willingly accept it felt like a betrayal. Finally, one woman, her hands shaking but determined, took a piece of bread. It was soft, warm, and for a moment she forgot where she was. She closed her eyes and took a small bite. The bread melted in her mouth. The taste was unlike anything she had experienced in months. The pork, real pork, not the thin slivers of mystery meat they had been given on rare occasions, was salty and savory, rich with a flavor she had long since forgotten. Her stomach clenched as the hunger inside her surged, and she swallowed it almost too quickly. Her eyes opened, and she looked around the room. The others were watching her, waiting for her reaction. The silence stretched, broken only by the soft sound of her chewing. Slowly, others began to reach for the food, some with hesitation, others with desperate need. It was as though they had all been starved of not just food, but of the possibility that they might be treated as human beings again. For a moment, they forgot they were prisoners. They forgot the war, the camps, the guards. They were just women, tasting something they had thought they would never taste again. But the suspicion lingered, thick in the air. They had been lied to before. This, too, could be a lie. But as the bread passed between them, slowly, uncertainly, like some fragile offering, the truth of it began to settle over them. The scent, the warmth, it was too real to deny. One woman, her face gaunt with hunger, took a slow, deliberate bite of the bread. She chewed, her expression unreadable. Her eyes flickered from the food to the others, as if waiting for some signal that this was allowed, that it was safe. And then, as though a dam had broken, the others followed suit. One by one, they tasted what had been sent to them, the bread, the pork, the bacon. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The bread was soft, a texture they had long forgotten, a luxury they could barely remember. The bacon, crisp and smoky, dissolved in their mouths, filling their empty stomachs with more than just sustenance. It was comfort, it was warmth. It was something they hadn't dared hope for in months. But it was also shock, the kind that pierced deep into their souls. The food was good, too good. They had been told that the enemy, the Americans, were monsters, that to be captured by them would be to experience pain beyond comprehension. But this was kindness, and kindness, in the place they had come to know as the end of the world, felt like betrayal. There was no jubilation, no tears of relief. There was only silence. The women ate, each bite a small, guilty surrender. Some chewed slowly, as though savoring the moment, while others devoured the food with desperation. None of them spoke. How could they? The very act of eating, of accepting what the enemy had sent, felt like a betrayal of their beliefs, their families, their emperor. For years they had been taught that to surrender meant disgrace, that death was preferable to capture. They had been told that mercy was weakness. But here, in their hands, was proof that mercy existed. And worse, it came from the enemy. The internal struggle that followed was almost unbearable. One woman, her hands trembling, wiped her mouth, but her mind raced. How could she accept this? How could she, one of the proud warriors of Japan, eat this food and not dishonor her ancestors? Her mother had taught her that war was sacred, that loyalty to the emperor was the highest honor. And yet here she was, breaking bread with those she had been taught to despise. Another woman sitting beside her was quiet, her face unreadable, but her hands were steady as she reached for another piece of pork. The food felt foreign in her mouth, its richness too much for her senses to handle. She had lived on scraps for so long, her body had grown accustomed to the taste of suffering. Now, with every bite, she felt the weight of her own survival. But it wasn't just the food that felt strange. It was the fact that the enemy had given it to them. The cowboy who had sent this food, what kind of man was he? He was an American soldier, just as they had been told, a member of the army that had bombed their cities, that had ravaged their homeland. He was one of the men they had been taught to hate, to fear. Yet here he was, offering them not bombs, but bread, not destruction, but sustenance. The dissonance of it twisted in their minds, a question they could not yet voice. How could they reconcile this kindness with everything they had been taught about the enemy? The camp was a place of deprivation, of struggle. It was a world of hunger and sickness, where the walls felt like they were closing in on them every day. They had learned to accept pain as part of their fate, to live without hope, without comfort. But now, as they sat in silence, the smell of bacon still hanging in the air, they realized that their world had shifted. It was not just the food that had changed. It was everything they had ever believed. The kindness of this small act had cracked the foundation of their understanding of the war. Their enemy, the ones they had feared and despised, had shown them a humanity they never thought possible. The realization settled over them like a heavy weight. If the Americans could treat them with dignity, then what had all the suffering been for? What was the point of the war, of the years of indoctrination, if the enemy was capable of compassion? Each woman wrestled with this thought in her own way, but none of them could escape the question. What now? Would they be able to live with this contradiction? Or had the act of eating, the simple act of accepting the food, already changed them forever? The answer, though, was not immediate. No one spoke. The moment of quiet rebellion had begun, but it was not something they could share aloud. Instead, they ate, each bite pushing them further away from the world they had known. The camp, the war, the struggle, it all seemed suddenly distant, unreal. For a fleeting moment, they were not prisoners of war, not Japanese or American, but simply women sharing a meal. And as they finished what had been sent to them, the silence grew, not as an absence, but as a new beginning. Before he was a soldier, before he became part of the war, he was just a young man from the plains of Nebraska. His name was Carl. He had grown up in a small town where the horizon stretched wide and uninterrupted, and the land seemed to speak to you in its own quiet, steadfast language. He had always worked hard, rising before dawn to tend to the fields with his father, learning the weight of labor and the value of simplicity. His mother, with her soft hands and gentle voice, taught him the quiet joys of life, the beauty of a sunset, the peace in a shared meal, the calm of a still night under a blanket of stars. It was a life that was far removed from the noise of the world. But then, in the spring of 1941, war changed everything. Carl found himself swept up in something that had little to do with the land he loved, and everything to do with something far more complicated, far more terrifying. The world was at war, and he, like so many others, was caught in its current. He was drafted into the army, a simple cowboy turned soldier. At first, he didn't know what to make of it all. The men around him were filled with a strange sense of purpose, a hatred for the enemy that Carl couldn't fully understand. He was a soldier now, but his mind often drifted back to the farm, to the simple life he had left behind. The battles in the Pacific were brutal. The heat, the incessant noise, the constant threat of death. It wore at him. Carl wasn't sure where his place in all of this was. He had always believed in justice, in the right to defend those who could not defend themselves. But now, standing in a war zone, he saw the other side of the coin. His comrades were filled with anger. Righteous anger, they called it, but it felt hollow to Carl. It felt like something more dangerous. It felt like hatred, and in the midst of that hatred, he began to feel a tug on his heart. What was it that he was fighting for, really? Was it for freedom, or was it simply to destroy? The question gnawed at him in the quiet moments between battles, when the noise of war finally quieted down. One day, during a break from the front lines, Carl sat alone, writing a letter to his mother. He wrote about the heat, about the constant tension, about his comrades who seemed to care only for victory. But there was something else, something he didn't know how to put into words. He wrote about the prisoners he had seen, the women who were caught in the conflict as much as he was, though they hadn't chosen it. They had been taken, held captive, stripped of their humanity. The idea of them haunted him, the thought that they were someone's daughters, someone's sisters. He couldn't shake it. And so, in the quiet of that moment, Carl made a decision. He had no idea what it would mean or what would come of it, but he would send them a package. Food, something to remind them that they were not forgotten. It wasn't much, just a few cans of pork, some fresh bread from the last meal he had, a little bit of bacon. Simple things, things that might bring comfort, even if only for a moment. He had no way of knowing it, but that simple gesture would change everything. That package, that small act of empathy, would plant a seed of doubt in the hearts of the women in the camp, slowly chipping away at the walls they had built around their own hatred. For Carl, it was just a gesture, one of kindness in the midst of war. But for those women, it would be the beginning of a journey that would take them far from the beliefs they had held for so long. Carl never knew what became of his package. He never knew that it would break down the walls of hatred, that it would challenge the beliefs of those who received it. For him, it was just another day in the war, another moment of quiet resistance against the brutality of it all. But for the women, it was something far greater. It was the beginning of their own internal revolution. But for the women, it was something far greater. It was the beginning of their own internal revolution. Days passed, and the food, the simple act of kindness, rippled through their camp, leaving confusion and a sense of unease in its wake. The first package had been an anomaly, a strange and jarring departure from everything they had been taught to expect. But soon others followed. More packages arrived, each one filled with unexpected gifts: chocolate, fresh fruit, new clothes. For the first time in months, the women tasted sweetness, smelled fresh apples, felt fabric that was not threadbare or stained with dirt. The once hollow, empty feeling that had lived in their bellies began to soften. But so did something deeper, their sense of certainty. The act of kindness that had seemed like an aberration now began to feel like something intentional, something persistent. The flood of kindness could not be ignored. Each package added to the confusion, each bite of fresh fruit added to the dissonance that was growing in their minds. Was this truly the enemy? Were these the people who had been painted as monstrous, as barbaric, as beings without honor? Some women, wary of such vulnerability, tried to dismiss the kindness. They hoarded their chocolates, saving them for moments when they could eat alone, away from the others. They could not bear to accept the gift without questioning it. To do so, to enjoy the comfort, felt like betrayal, betrayal to their families, to their comrades, to their very identity. Loyalty to the emperor had been the foundation of their existence. And that loyalty, they had been taught, demanded that they never surrender, never show weakness. But with each act of kindness, their beliefs were chipped away, piece by piece, until they began to question their own understanding of honor. One woman, Keiko, a nurse who had watched her comrades fall on the battlefield, found herself struggling more than the others. Raised to believe in the inviolability of Bushido, she had sworn to herself that she would die before she allowed herself to be captured. Yet here she was, fed by the enemy, receiving more than she could have ever imagined back home. She had heard stories of the Allies' barbarism, how they would mock and torment those they captured. But she had not experienced that. Instead, the guards had shown restraint, respect even. They had offered cigarettes, water, and sometimes a quiet word of encouragement when her fatigue showed. It unsettled her deeply. Was it all a lie? Had they been told nothing but falsehoods? constructed by a government too desperate to face the truth? One evening, as she sat quietly with a fellow prisoner, they exchanged a simple, tentative question. "Do you think they're really our enemies?" It was spoken in a whisper, as though the very thought was treasonous, but the words hung in the air, potent with possibility. What if the story they had been told about the Americans was wrong? What if the suffering they had endured in the name of patriotism had been for something less noble than they had been led to believe? The realization slowly began to dawn on them. Perhaps the propaganda they had lived with their entire lives might be flawed. Perhaps the stories they had been told about their enemies, about the Americans, had been nothing more than a carefully constructed illusion. If their captors could show mercy, could treat them with dignity, then what was the truth of the war? The walls of belief that had once been so solid began to crack, and the women were left to pick up the pieces. Would they be able to reconcile these new truths with the old ones? Would they ever see the world and themselves in the same way again? The answers were still unclear, but one thing was certain: their world had already begun to shift. As the days passed, the effects of the unexpected kindness became impossible to ignore. The women, once cold and withdrawn, began to change in subtle ways. It wasn't an immediate transformation, but a gradual softening. The hardened exteriors that had once been shields against the world began to chip away little by little. Where fear had once dominated their every action, now there were moments of quiet reflection. Some of them, like Keiko, dared to smile at the guards. The same guards who had once been terrifying to them, those who had patrolled their barracks with rifles slung over their shoulders, their eyes cold and unblinking, were now met with hesitant, almost shy smiles. It wasn't that they trusted them yet, but something had shifted. The soldiers had become more human to them, more like the men they had left behind in their villages, men who had families, men who had their own fears. It wasn't just the smiles. The women began to talk to each other more openly. Where silence had once ruled their barracks, now there were conversations that bordered on normalcy. They shared their experiences with one another, piecing together their fragmented lives. They began to realize that they were not the only ones who felt conflicted, who felt torn between their loyalty to their homeland and the strange kindness that their captors had shown them. It was as though a weight had been lifted from their shoulders. Finally, they could speak the truth that had been buried inside them for so long. And with every word they spoke, the walls of hatred they had built between themselves and the guards seemed to shrink. Emiko, who had once fiercely resisted any notion that the Americans could be anything but evil, now found herself speaking to the guards, asking them questions in broken English. "Where are you from?" she would ask, her voice trembling at first. To her surprise, the guard would answer, his eyes softening as he spoke of his family back home in the States, of his town in the Midwest, where he had grown up on a farm. It was surreal, and yet it felt almost comforting to hear that he, too, had a life beyond the war. But after each conversation, Emiko would retreat to her cot, her chest heavy with guilt. She had crossed a line that she could not uncross. It wasn't just a betrayal of her beliefs. It felt like a betrayal of herself, of the woman she had been before the war. The transformation in the women, though painful, was undeniable. They no longer saw the camp as just a place of captivity. It had become a place where their perceptions of the world were being shattered. It was no longer just about survival. It was about understanding. And that understanding, as difficult as it was to embrace, made it harder to hate, harder to hold on to the anger that had once been their armor. In the quiet of the camp, as the days stretched on, the women began to connect in ways they never had before. They no longer saw each other simply as prisoners. They saw each other as individuals with unique stories, dreams, and fears. The same was true of the soldiers who guarded them. What had once been a war of monsters on both sides was now beginning to seem less clear-cut. The emotional transformation, though slow, had already begun to change the dynamic between the women and their captors. Each act of kindness, however small, continued to chip away at the walls they had built around their hearts. But there was a cost to this transformation. It was one thing to receive kindness from the enemy. It was another to have to carry that kindness within you, knowing what it might mean back home. For many of the women, the hardest part wasn't the food or the physical comfort. It was the emotional weight that came with it. They had survived the war not just by resisting, but by holding tight to a set of beliefs, a code that told them what it meant to be honorable. Now, that very code was beginning to crumble, and with it, everything they had ever known about themselves. Keiko, the nurse, was the first to act on what she was feeling. One night, when the camp had quieted down, she sat at the small wooden desk in the corner of the barracks. The guards had given her a small piece of paper and a pencil, something she had once believed she would never see again. The idea of writing a letter had seemed absurd at first. After all, how could she write to her family, knowing what she had received from their supposed enemies? How could she explain that the very men they had been taught to fear had treated her with more kindness than her own officers ever had? But the letter needed to be written. It felt like a necessary act, a small way to reclaim her own voice, to make sense of the chaos in her heart. She wrote about the food, how it had filled her in a way she hadn't felt in months. She described the bread, the bacon, the richness of the soup, the warm cups of coffee. She wrote about the clothes they had been given, the fresh towels, the clean sheets. But more than that, she wrote about the unspoken kindness of the Americans. She had witnessed the guards, their faces softer than the fierce soldiers she had imagined, treating them not as subordinates to control, but as human beings. The simple gestures, offering a cigarette, a nod of acknowledgement, had pierced her armor in ways that words could never fully explain. She had written, "They treat us as though we matter." The letter was a confession. It was her reality, but it felt like a betrayal. When the letter was finished, Keiko folded it carefully, her hands trembling. She wasn't sure if it would ever reach Japan, or if anyone would read it at all. But in that moment, she felt something else, a flicker of the freedom she hadn't known she had lost. She was no longer just surviving, she was beginning to understand what it meant to live again. For the first time in months, she realized that survival wasn't just about enduring. It was about embracing what came next, even if it meant facing the truth of her own transformation. The internal struggle was not hers alone. Many of the women, faced with similar questions, chose silence instead of words. They couldn't bring themselves to write letters or speak of their experiences. They buried their emotions, trying to reconcile what they had been taught with what they were now feeling. But for others, there was a quiet rebellion, a quiet defiance against everything they had once believed. Some began to share their stories with each other, slowly, as though testing the waters. They began to understand the power of their own agency, realizing that they could no longer be passive victims in their own story. They were alive. And for the first time, they had the power to decide what kind of people they would become. And as they embraced that power, they began to look at the guards not just as captors, but as fellow humans, equally trapped in a system they could not control. But not all the women were ready to face this transformation. Some of them, their hearts heavy with the weight of betrayal, chose to reject the truth of their new reality. They continued to hide their emotions, to resist any notion that the enemy could be anything but evil. The tension between those who accepted the kindness and those who could not was palpable, creating a quiet divide within the camp. But one thing was certain: whether they accepted it or not, each woman had been forever changed. But as the war drew to a close, an unexpected arrival at the camp began to stir a final shift in the emotional landscape of the women. The usual routine of survival, of daily struggle, of adapting to what had seemed an unchanging world, was broken by the delivery of another package. This time, however, it wasn't just food. It was something deeper, something far more personal. As the box was opened, the contents revealed not just cans of food, fresh bread and fruit, but letters from the soldiers who had sent these packages over the course of the war. They were simple letters, filled with words of hope, of struggle, of shared humanity. And they were addressed to the women, the very women who had once been nothing more than objects of their duty, their prisoners. The letters were written with care, each one bearing the personal touch of a soldier, stories from home, expressions of regret for what had happened, and most poignantly, words of recognition. For the first time, the women could feel, through the words of their captors, that they were seen, not as faceless enemies, not as nameless prisoners, but as human beings. There, in black and white, was the truth that had been hidden from them all along. The men who had been their captors, the ones who had guarded them with guns and kept them in isolation, saw them as something more than enemies. They saw them as sisters, as daughters, as women who had suffered as much as they had. The significance of these letters was not lost on the women. They read through each one, their hands trembling as they processed the words. They had been taught that they were invincible, that their loyalty to their homeland was above all else, and that the enemy was simply evil, a faceless force to be destroyed. But now, with each letter, with each word of understanding, the walls that had once separated them from their captors began to fall. The soldiers had written not as enemies, but as men who had felt the same loneliness, the same uncertainty. They spoke of their hopes, of their longing to return home, of the families they missed. And in these shared emotions, the women realized they were not so different after all. The end of the war was near, and with it came the finality of everything they had known. The realization of the war's conclusion hit the women like a wave. The camp that had once been a place of suffering and survival was now a place of reflection. The emotional conflict that had lived inside them, the struggle to reconcile the brutality of war with the kindness they had experienced, began to make sense. For the first time, they saw the shift in power dynamics between captors and prisoners. The guards, the soldiers, were no longer just figures of authority. They were men who, like the women, had borne the weight of this war. They had been forced to play their roles, just as the women had been forced into captivity. As the war officially ended and the women were led to freedom, there was a quiet sense of release, but also of loss. The emotional resolution they had been seeking was not an easy one. The letters had opened a new door, one that forced them to face the complexities of human nature and the cost of survival. They realized that their understanding of humanity had irrevocably shifted. What had been a war of enemies had now become a war of individuals, each one with their own fears, their own desires, and their own capacity for kindness. The women, as they walked away from the camp, knew they would never see their captors again, but they would carry with them the realization that kindness, no matter how small, had the power to break down even the hardest walls. For the first time in months, the women stepped beyond the confines of the camp, their bodies stiff, but their hearts filled with an uncertainty they hadn't expected. The sight of the open road, the quiet that stretched around them, felt almost unnatural. They had been so long in the rhythm of survival that now, in their newfound freedom, they didn't quite know what to do with themselves. But they were free, free to walk, to breathe without the constant weight of captivity pressing down on them. However, that freedom felt more like an empty space, a vast unknown that stretched ahead of them. The journey home was not long, but it felt like a lifetime. They boarded trains and sat in silence, the hum of the engine a dull soundtrack to their thoughts. Some of the women still clutched their small belongings, a blanket, a few letters from the camp, scraps of paper that once carried words of kindness. The world outside the window was unfamiliar to them. When they had left Japan, it had been full of promises, full of expectations, but now the landscape was a grim reflection of what they had been through. They had been prisoners of war, but Japan had also been a prisoner, of its ideology, of its leaders, of the war that had ravaged it. When they finally arrived home, their hearts sank at the sight that greeted them. The country they had fought for was in ruins. Cities that had once been bustling, full of life, were now little more than smoldering remains. Buildings stood in skeletal silence, their glass windows shattered, their roofs caved in by bombs. The air, once filled with the hum of industry, was now thick with smoke, the remnants of a war that had torn everything apart. Their homeland, which had once felt like a foundation of strength, was now reduced to rubble. It was overwhelming, the weight of the destruction. The streets were filled with the remnants of lives that had been erased by war, the twisted metal of abandoned vehicles, the broken husks of homes, the piles of ash where neighborhoods used to stand. Some women began to weep softly as they looked at the devastation. Others walked in stunned silence, unable to reconcile the place they had left with the place they had returned to. They had returned, but they didn't know how to belong here anymore. What had they fought for? What had they endured, only to return to a country that felt unrecognizable? For so long, they had lived with the belief that Japan was invincible, that they were invincible. But the ruins told a different story. They had survived captivity, but their homeland had not survived the war. The city they had once known, their homes, their families, their world, was gone. And in its place, there was something new, something that felt like a foreign land. As they moved through the streets, the women were faced with memories of the camp, of the war, of everything they had experienced in the last few years. But they were also faced with something else, the kindness they had received from the enemy. How could they reconcile the treatment they had received in captivity with the country they had returned to? The soldiers who had guarded them, who had treated them with respect, with kindness, they had become a part of their story. They had been taught that the Americans were their enemies, that they were to be feared and despised. But those same soldiers had shown them humanity in ways their own had not. How could they come back to this, to a nation that had given them nothing but loss and devastation, and not feel torn between the world they had known and the world they now understood? For the first time in their lives, the women understood the true cost of war. It was not just the loss of lives, but the loss of self. They had left the camp as prisoners of war, but they had returned to a broken country, and as they walked through the streets, their hearts heavy with the weight of it all, they knew that their world had irrevocably changed. If you are enjoying this story, please hit like and leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Years had passed since the war's end, and life had moved forward in ways they hadn't anticipated. The women who had survived the camps had scattered to different corners of the world, but the bond they shared, the bond formed not just through shared trauma, but through the unexpected kindness of their captors, had never fully dissolved. In the quiet moments, when they thought back to the simplicity of those early days after their release, they remembered the packages, the small, simple gestures that had once seemed so foreign but had transformed them. They had returned to lives filled with rebuilding, but something in each of them had been irrevocably changed. Now they were older, their faces marked by time, but their eyes held the weight of everything they had experienced together. It was a quiet reunion, not a grand gathering, but one that felt more significant than anything they had done before. They met in a small room, a modest gathering place, far from the shattered streets of their youth, far from the pain of war. They were now women with families, with lives that had grown around them, but the echoes of the past lingered in the corners of the room. One by one, they sat together, looking at each other with a mixture of recognition and wonder. Time had changed them, but it had not taken away what they had shared. In their faces, they saw traces of the women they had once been, the ones who had endured unimaginable hardship, who had learned to survive in a world of captivity. But they also saw something else, the women they had become, the ones who had found empathy where they had once found only fear, the ones who had learned that kindness could change everything. The conversation began slowly. They shared stories of their lives since the war, of the families they had raised, of the countries they had rebuilt. But as the conversation turned to their experiences in the camps, a quiet catharsis began to unfold. They talked about the fear, the hunger, and the pain, but they also talked about the strange kindness that had been given to them, the food, the letters, the small gestures that had changed their understanding of what it meant to be human. It was still difficult to talk about, to admit that the enemy, whom they had been taught to despise, had shown them more humanity than their own had in many ways. But as they spoke, they realized something profound. They had been changed by those moments, but they had also been freed. They no longer carried the same bitterness in their hearts, the same unrelenting hatred that had once fueled them. They had learned to see people not as enemies, but as individuals, and that shift had altered the course of their lives. One woman, now elderly, sat quietly in the corner as the others spoke. Her name was Keiko, the same woman who had written the first letter all those years ago. She had never fully reconciled the weight of what she had written, of the kindness she had received from the Americans. But now, sitting here with the other women, she felt the burden lifting. It had taken years, but she had come to understand that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness could shift the course of history and even change a person's life. The food, the letters, the kindness from those who were once enemies, it had all been part of something greater than any of them had realized. It had been a moment in time that had taught them something essential about humanity. As the women stood to leave, they exchanged quiet hugs, their bonds now strengthened not just by shared trauma, but by shared understanding. The war had taken so much from them, but in the years since, they had learned what it meant to be whole again. They had learned that kindness, even in the darkest of times, could bring light to the most desolate of places. And as they parted ways, they carried that lesson with them, not just as a memory, but as a legacy to pass on to future generations. The final reckoning was not in the battles fought or the lives lost, but in the understanding that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can change everything. They had endured so much, yet, standing together, they knew they would never be the same again. Years had passed since the end of the war, and their lives had taken them in many different directions. Some had rebuilt families, others had found new homes in countries far from the land that had once been their battlefield. But no matter how far they went, no matter how much time passed, the memories of the camp and the lessons they had learned would never fade. The kindness, the unexpected empathy, had changed them. It had made them question everything they had once believed about themselves and about the world. And as they moved through their lives, the memory of the cowboy's gift remained, a small act of humanity that had had an unimaginable impact on their hearts. The war had taught them the most painful lessons of their lives, loss, sacrifice, and survival. It had shattered their worldview, leaving them to question not only the ideas they had been raised with, but also the very meaning of loyalty and honor. The camp, the years of captivity, had been a brutal test of endurance. But it was also where they had learned the power of empathy in the face of hatred, where they had seen that the smallest act of kindness could break through the walls of fear and prejudice that had been built around them. For each of the women, the journey was different. Some found peace in the years after the war, though that peace was often fraught with moments of reflection, when they remembered the faces of the American soldiers who had treated them with respect and kindness. Keiko, who had once questioned her own loyalty and honor, found solace in sharing the story of the letter she had written to her family, recounting not just the food they had received, but the humanity that had been shown to them. For her, the transformation from hatred to understanding had not been a smooth path, but it had been one that allowed her to live with the knowledge that even in the darkest times there is room for light. The impact of those small acts of kindness lingered in ways the women could never have predicted. One woman, who had once refused to speak to any of the soldiers, later found herself teaching her children about the importance of seeing people for who they truly were, not for the stereotypes and fears that had been taught to them. She would speak of the men who had offered them bacon, who had listened to their stories without judgment, who had treated them with dignity when they had expected nothing but cruelty. It was a lesson she had learned the hard way, but one she carried with her for the rest of her life. The gifts, the letters, the moments of quiet understanding, these were not just fleeting memories. They were the foundation upon which the women built their new lives, understanding that kindness could bridge the deepest divides, even in the aftermath of war. The kindness of a stranger, a soldier who had once been an enemy, had changed them forever. It had opened their eyes to the reality that war doesn't just destroy. It also creates opportunities for unexpected connections, for the building of empathy across seemingly insurmountable barriers. And as the years continued to pass, these women, now mothers, grandmothers, and great-grandmothers, carried with them not only the trauma of their experiences, but also the lessons that had shaped their understanding of humanity. They taught their children and grandchildren that even in times of conflict, there is always a choice to show kindness, to offer empathy, to understand the other person not as an enemy, but as a fellow human being. The small, seemingly insignificant act of sending food, of writing a letter, had changed their lives, and through them it would continue to change generations to come. The lasting legacy of their story was simple but profound. In times of conflict, the most powerful weapon we have is our ability to choose kindness over hatred, understanding over fear. And while the scars of war may never fully fade, the small acts of compassion that emerge in its wake have the power to heal, to transform, and to create a new world, one where humanity, not conflict, defines our future. If you enjoyed this story, please hit like and leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from.